McNutt here. If you love jaw-dropping survival stories where the odds are stacked so high that making it out alive can only be seen as impossible, you're in for a wild ride. First up, a man whose death was beyond certain, and somehow he found the courage and the superhuman strength to look death right in the eye and say over and over again, "Not today." Then the mind-blowing story of a teenage girl whose plane ripped apart during a thunderstorm, causing her to plummet 2 miles from the sky. That was only the beginning of her story. Completely alone with broken bones, rotting flesh, and surrounded by caiman and piranha, she realized no one was coming for her. Buckle up. These two stories are intense. Let's start with Frozen Hell. In the early 1900s, the golden age of exploration was coming to an end. Every corner of the world had largely been visited, conquered, and claimed by a few countries that were intent on owning everything. However, that need to explore, to discover, to be the first, was still a burning ember in many adventurous souls. But was there anywhere left that needed a good exploring? Just one place. And seriously, you have to really want to explore to go to the most inhospitable place on Earth. Of course, I'm talking about Antarctica. At the time, the sexy legend-securing challenge was to be the first to reach the South Pole. But which South Pole? There are two. In 1907, famous explorer Ernest Shackleton led an exploration to the geographic South Pole. He didn't make it, but his expedition was the first to summit Mount Erebus, and they did make it to the magnetic South Pole. And those are two pretty snazzy patches to put on your explorer sash. While it does vary, the distance between the magnetic and the geographic South Poles at the time was 1,700 miles. That's the equivalent of walking from Chicago to Los Angeles in these conditions. Shackleton may sound familiar to you since one of his later expeditions aboard the now infamous and recently discovered Endurance had plans to cross the entire Antarctic continent. They became stranded in a crushing ice pack for almost 2 years. The ill-fated ship was literally crushed and shoved to the bottom of the ocean. But, amazingly, everyone survived. So, happy ending? However, that is not the ordeal that I want to share with you today. One of the men in Shackleton's failed expedition to the South Pole was Douglas Mawson. This is his story. In 1912, Mawson was asked to join Robert Falcon Scott in his attempt to reach the geographic South Pole. Mawson declined because he was more interested in leading a scientific expedition to gather information and map the region. So instead, he led the Australasian Antarctic expedition. When they arrived at base camp in Commonwealth Bay, they were met with 50-mile-per-hour winds, often gusting up to 200 miles per hour, and near constant blizzard-like conditions. That's a Category 5 hurricane with blinding snow and far below zero temperatures. Obviously, humans aren't meant to be in this place. Hypothermia and frostbite are virtual certainties. There are no plants nor animals to eat once you leave the shore. No trees to build a shelter, and with the exception of some lichen and hardy microbes, the continent is virtually lifeless. Mawson divided his men into 4 teams. 3 teams would explore different routes, while 1 team stayed at base camp to further advance that facility. Mawson chose Lieutenant Belgrave Ninus, who was the dog handler for the expedition, and Ninus' friend, Xavier Mertz, a 28-year-old Swiss lawyer and cross-country ski champion, and a never-ending source of great energy. When I say never-ending, I'm getting ahead of myself. Mawson's team was a powerhouse. With 3 sleds and 16 huskies, they covered 300 miles in the first month of travel. I have to stop here for a second to make sure you understand what they were crossing. Sometimes they got smooth ground and perhaps that roaring wind was at their backs. Lovely. Still, snow blindness and debilitating freezing temperatures were kind of like mosquitoes in Louisiana, ever-present, uncomfortable, and inescapable. But the real danger was crossing glaciers. Glacier fields are terrifying. Glaciers are always in motion, slow motion, but enough motion that enormous pressure builds up and can suddenly shift violently, causing the ground to collapse into the abyss. The most immediate danger of glaciers are snow bridges. Imagine a 400-foot crevasse or chasm that has been covered by falling snow. The snow bridge looks exactly like the solid ground you're standing on, but your next step could suddenly have you feeling as if you're skydiving. Back to our story. As you've likely guessed, the luck of this fast-moving crew was about to run out. On December 13th, 1912, yes, of course, the 13th was a Friday the 13th, the team set up camp for the night. Mawson decided to redistribute the supplies and condense everything down to 2 sleds. During the night, the team could hear the distant booms of nearby glaciers. Mertz, the cross-country ski champion, was well aware of the potential dangers. The next day was warmer by the insane standard of Antarctica, and that's not a good thing for ground stability. As Ninus and Mawson drove the sleds, Mertz skied ahead to help navigate any hazards. Mawson looked up and saw that Mertz was holding a ski pole, signaling a crevasse. Mawson turned back to confirm that Ninus had seen the signal. Mawson looked ahead once more, and he could see that Mertz was standing there, clearly distressed about something. Mawson looked back to see that Ninus, his dogs, and the sled were gone. Mawson and Mertz raced back to search for Ninus. They cautiously crawled toward the newly revealed chasm and looked down to see 2 dogs, one dead and one in agony, on an ice shelf about 150 feet below. Just beyond the ice shelf, a black void that seemed to go into the depths of the earth. The 2 men called out for Ninus for hours. Eventually, they had no choice but to accept that Ninus was gone. They performed a burial service and began planning their return to base camp. When Ninus fell into the earth, he took virtually all of their food, the tent, and the other supplies with him. A literal death sentence for the 2 men still alive. Knowing they were at least 4 to 5 weeks from base camp, the 2 men realized they would only survive by eating their dogs. Mawson wrote in his diary, "May God help us." It won't surprise you to know that things are about to get worse, a lot worse. That night, they made it back to the site where Mawson had decided to abandon one of the sleds. They took it apart and were able to fashion a makeshift shelter. They killed the weakest dog, ate the flesh and liver, and fed the rest to the other dogs. For a few days, the 2 men were able to move at a pace you might expect from someone racing against death. Their efforts came to a halt when Mawson was struck with a painful bout of snowblindness. Mertz bathed Mawson's eyes with a solution of zinc sulfate and cocaine. While this may sound like a strange attempt, zinc sulfate is an antiseptic with anti-inflammatory benefits, and cocaine is a strong anesthetic as well as a powerful vasoconstrictor that could have provided some pain relief. Either way, things continued to trend downward as the next of the seemingly constant storms slammed the area with a whiteout. I could continue to say, but then things got worse, but that's really going to get redundant. So just assume that if I'm still talking and going on to another topic, then yeah, somehow it's just going from one level of frozen hell to the next increasingly awful level of frozen hell. It's a pattern. With only dog meat on the menu, deficiencies are bound to pop up. On January 5th, 1913, the physical state of Mertz began to deteriorate. Although rot may have been a better word, skin started falling off of his legs. Mertz insisted that a day's rest would give him that boost he so desperately needed. The men decided to hold for 24 hours. It's important to note here that they were racing several clocks at once. Starvation and freezing to death weren't even in the top spot of priority. You see, the Aurora, the ship that would take them home, would be leaving soon. They knew the agreed upon date of departure, February 8th, and they knew the ship would not wait. A day of rest, no matter how urgently needed, was essentially a step closer to death. On January 6th, the day that Mertz wanted to take a day off and rest, Mawson wrote a harrowing entry. Imagine being Mawson, sitting in a small, improvised tent with pencil and paper, wind howling, frostbite coming at you from every angle, his friend and colleague laying next to him, literally decaying, as he writes, "Things are in a most serious state for both of us. If he, Mertz, cannot go 8 to 10 miles a day, in a day or two, we are doomed. I could pull myself through with the provisions at hand, but I cannot leave him. His heart seems to have gone. It is very hard for me. To be within 100 miles of the hut and in such a position is awful." The next morning, the mind of Mertz followed his decaying body as he began having fits of rage. The 2 men were, against all odds, and I mean all of them, all of the odds, somehow able to get moving again. As they set up their next base camp, Mertz snapped into a bizarre delirium and managed to break a tent pole. At obvious great risk to himself, Mawson grabbed Mertz and held him. Incredibly, this seemed to calm the man. Mawson put Mertz back into his sleeping bag, and around 2 a.m., the tortured Mertz passed away in his sleep. With his energy already dangerously low, Mawson cut out enough blocks of ice to entomb Mertz. He had to move on if he had any hope of surviving. Mawson was now approximately 100 miles from base camp, separated by the most dangerous terrain on Earth, and his own body was starting to decay as his nose and lips began to break open. What drives a man to take the next step, even when the body has already begun to die? For Mawson, it was the thought of his fiancée, Bequita, and the overwhelming need to tell the story of his fallen comrades. Days later, Mawson's feet were hurting so intensely he had to stop and tend to them. He discovered that the soles of his feet had become detached. The soles of his feet were detached from his foot. His entire body was disintegrating. He was covered in blisters, open sores, and suffering from frostbite as his body was telling him in no uncertain terms that he was dying, virtually decomposing. But Mawson somehow refused to accept the message. He wrapped his feet in wire, detached soul and all. I said I wouldn't say this, but if you can believe it, yeah, things are about to get worse. On January 17th, Mawson falls through a snow bridge into a crevasse that, as far as he can tell, has no bottom. Fortunately, he had tied himself to the sled and his body snapped to a sudden stop above the black abyss as he dangled and spun, waiting for the sled to join him in his final fall. But it didn't happen. Yes, he could feel the sled inching toward the edge. He had to make a decision: dangle and die, or try to climb back to the surface. Let me ask you this right now. Could you climb a 15-foot rope, assuming you had a decent night's sleep and a lovely breakfast and are completely healthy? Could you do it? Now put yourself in the bloody, rotting, flesh-filled boots of Douglas Mawson in a state of decay, starvation, hands split open and actively bleeding. Could you do it then? Well, because this man simply refused to die, he somehow poked the Grim Reaper in the eye once more, and after a few failed attempts, miraculously pulled his practically lifeless body to the surface. Now, I know at this point you're probably on the fence with what's best, death or the extension of unimaginable suffering. It had to be a coin flip. Knowing he wasn't the luckiest of men, he spent the night fashioning a rope ladder in case he were to fall into another crevasse, which of course he did the very next day. January is coming to an end, and Mawson can barely manage 4 to 5 miles per day, which really seems like a lot under the circumstances. The departure of the Aurora is getting closer as Mawson's health meter is blinking red with a siren blaring. He has to continually stop to redress his open wounds. His hair is falling out. Each step is another milestone of human endurance. So, of course, an intense blizzard hits. Knowing this will slow him down, he pushes even harder and was able to cover 8 miles before the struggle of building a nightly camp. But the next day brought sunshine and what must have been accompanied by the sound of angels singing. He could make out the coast of Commonwealth Bay. Base camp was only 40 miles away. 40 miles. However, he knew there was a nearby cave named Aladdin's Cave with supplies that was only 30 miles away. He pressed on, and by February 1st, he made it to the shelter of Aladdin's Cave. Here, he was overwhelmed at the sight of oranges and a pineapple that had been left there. Not because they were food or would provide critical vitamins and non-dog calories, but because he was finally able to look at something that wasn't white. Remember, the Aurora is scheduled to leave on February 8th, and Mawson now only has 10 miles to go, so of course, another huge storm hits, forcing him to take shelter in the cave for 5 days. When the storm finally gave way, he embarked on the last leg of his horrific march and made it to base camp just in time to watch the Aurora sail off in the distance. Really, that happened. Yep, just like that. He actually saw the ship sailing away. However, the consolation prize wasn't as bad as it could have been. A small team of men had remained behind to wait for him, believing that there could be survivors. He had to remain in Antarctica for another winter before returning home. Mawson later stated he was grateful for this slow period of recovery and time with this smaller group of men to heal and process all that he had been through. Douglas Mawson had survived a virtually impossible set of circumstances in the most inhospitable terrain on planet Earth, and he set the standard for mental fortitude and the ability to simply move forward, no matter how slowly or painfully, in hopes that those movements may eventually lead to a better day. What about the driving force that kept him going, his lovely Paquita? Well, they were married and lived a long life together, raising 2 daughters. Mawson passed away in 1958. Paquita buried beside her husband in 1974. Well done, Sir Douglas Mawson, and thank you so much for watching. Douglas Mawson's remarkable story of survival will stand as a testament to what a human can endure. Could anything ever equal the impossible journey of survival by such a legendary, tough-as-nails adventurer? How about a mind-blowing tale of a 17-year-old girl who plummeted 2 miles from the sky as her airplane ripped apart during a violent thunderstorm? And incredibly, surviving the fall was just the beginning of her ordeal. Brace for impact, because this next story will leave you in absolute awe. This is Skyfall. Hey, McNutt here. I'm about to tell you one of the most improbable, seemingly impossible stories you've ever heard. But it's so much more than that. Yes, this story has been told many times across the intertubes. But the entirety of the story, the fact that it is, at its heart, a story of destiny, unthinkable tragedy, and also great achievement, is known by too few. For those of you vaguely familiar with the story, it starts with a miserable excuse of an airplane essentially disintegrating in the sky and a 17-year-old girl falling 2 miles through a massive thunderstorm into the Amazon jungle. And that's a lot, but if you really want to understand this miraculous survival, you have to go back almost 2 decades to understand how this young lady was able to survive and ultimately make the dream of her parents into a glorious reality that, in a way, serves us all. Imagine you're flying around and suddenly day turns to night. Turbulence tosses your plane like a child bouncing a toy off the nearest wall. And in an instant, everyone on board vanishes and you are alone, strapped in your seat, falling from unthinkable heights to the earth below. Hold on to that image. We have to head to Germany over 20 years earlier. Okay, I wrote an entire sub-story for this section, but it's too long. It's amazing, but you clicked on one story and I don't want to distract you with another, but I have to give you the bullet point, cliff notes, cheat sheet, highlights of this remarkable journey of our subject's father. It's critical for the big picture and it's 100% worthy of a feature film all on its own, not joking in the slightest. So, in 1947, a young man, Hans Wilhelm Kopke, finished his doctorate degree in biology and wanted nothing more than to study the remarkable biology and ecological diversity of the Amazon rainforest in Peru. He wrote to the University of Lima to inquire about a position. A full year later, he gets a reply, obviously email could have solved a lot of problems here, that indeed they did have a position for him. The plan, he would go to Peru while his new fiancée Maria completes her doctorate and joins him later. But there was one problem, he had no money. Germany is here and Peru is here. Telekinetic transportation had not yet been invented. The short story of Hans' solo trip to Peru for his dream job is that he, on foot, crossed the Alps in winter, tried to climb over a high fence, fell, was hospitalized, healed, went under the fence on the second try, got arrested for being in Italy illegally, spent several months in prison until a rainstorm caused the prison walls to collapse. He escaped, hiked to France, crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, stowed away in the belly of a ship that was transporting salt while buried in salt for days, was discovered as a stowaway and arrested again. The ship arrives in South America. Woohoo! He made it. He was tossed immediately in jail. Released 2 weeks later, and he begins walking across this. He catches a train in Brazil and makes it to Lima, Peru. 2 years after he was sent the letter that the university had a position for him, which they no longer did. He did get a job at the Natural History Museum. His fiancée Maria came to Peru by plane, lazy. She got a job at the Natural History Museum as well, and they both became highly respected and influential scientists and advocates of the rainforest with a dream of creating a nature reserve. Oh, and they had a little girl named Julianne. And right about now, she is boarding a plane for one of the most horrifying experiences you can imagine. Thank the gods she's her father's daughter. On Christmas Eve 1971, Julianne Kupke and her mom Maria were trying to get from Lima to Pucallpa to see her father, Hans. He specifically told the two travelers not to fly Lanza Airlines. It was widely known to be unsafe, but the airport was packed because many flights had been canceled the day before. If they didn't fly Lanza, they wouldn't make it in time for the holidays. The chaos at the airport was highlighted by a very determined man trying feverishly to get his film crew booked for his current project, Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Most people know Werner Herzog as the legendary documentarian known for, among other things, his fierce determination. Herzog and his peeps were able to get another plane, but that won't be his last appearance in this story. Julianne and her mother Maria boarded Flight 508, a Lockheed Electra L-188A. Julianne sat in row 19, seat F. She took the window seat with her mom next to her and a portly man on the aisle. Julianne loved flying, but her mom did not. The flight was only about an hour long. Toward the end, the sky suddenly turned black as the pilots flew directly into a massive, powerful thunderstorm. As if the sudden darkness weren't concerning enough, brutal turbulence hit the plane hard. This plane was not designed to handle turbulence. Julianne remembers the overhead storage bins bursting open as Christmas gifts, flowers, and luggage joined the already airborne dishes and lunch that had already been served. It was chaos and everyone was terrified. Julianne saw a brilliant flash of light over the wing. She couldn't tell if it was an explosion or a lightning strike. At that moment, her terrified mother calmly said, "Now it's all over." The next thing Julianne remembers is being alone in row 19, seat F. Her mother was gone, the fat man was gone, and the plane was gone. She was falling from the sky, seatbelt snapped in place so tight it was painful. She was falling from 2 miles high in the dark, lightning-plagued sky, spiraling towards Earth. Julianne's free fall likely lasted a little over a minute. That's a really long time. Try holding your breath for a minute. Actually, hold your breath for a minute and then start the timer to get an idea of how long Julianne's minute was. She would have experienced below freezing temperatures, struggled to breathe, and likely hit a velocity of around 120 miles per hour, all while watching the Earth zoom toward her. Impact was inevitable. Death was certain. Except it wasn't. One of the last thoughts she had prior to blacking out was that the jungle looked like tight bunches of broccoli. And that's exactly what saved her. I should clarify, I'm not implying that eating your broccoli will save you in similar situations, although if steamed properly with some butter and salt, it can be really good and is packed with vitamins, minerals, potassium. But an open field or less dense, not as tall jungle canopy would not have slowed her down enough. The fact that she landed in an old-growth, densely packed, tall rainforest is likely the key factor of her survival. And that would be reason number 673 to restore as much forested land as possible. Am I right? When she woke, she was under the row of seats and her seatbelt was unfastened. She believes she must have awakened earlier to unclip her seatbelt but has no memory of it. She simply laid still under the row of seats for the rest of the night as the rain poured down. Sometime later the next day, she felt dizzy and unstable but started to move. She finds a cut on her calf, but after several attempts, is able to stand. Looking around, she sees no debris, no bodies, just her 3-person passenger seat. The jungle looks undisturbed. She now only has one shoe, a floppy sandal, and her glasses are gone. A problem for many reasons, but especially in a jungle where many venomous snakes look like vines or leaves. Her mini dress is not standard issue survival attire. Her only advantage is her calm nature and knowledge of the jungle that she has essentially been raised with. She notices an injury on the back of her right arm. It's small, about an inch deep, but it's not bleeding. Her collarbone is broken, but incredibly not painful. As a person who has experienced 5 broken collarbones, I simply don't understand this. Thirsty, she licks water from nearby leaves and starts to evaluate her predicament. In most survival situations, the standard advice is to stay put and allow rescue to come to you. Julianne decides to start moving. She's well aware of how visually disorienting a jungle can be, So to avoid walking in circles, she finds a tree in the distance with a distinct feature and moves toward it, finds another, and again, and again, and again. She couldn't understand why there were no more signs of debris or wreckage, but soon she does find a bit of debris in the form of a small bag of candy and a traditional Peruvian Christmas cake that was too disgusting to eat. I'm not knocking Peruvian Christmas cakes, but this one was soaked with rain and mud. Obviously, thoughts of her mother occupy her mind. She calls for her periodically, as well as other survivors, but nothing comes back. The first nearly comforting sound she hears is a search plane flying above the dense canopy, but there's just no way to be seen. How can she be rescued if she can't be seen? She knows she has to find a way out of the jungle. As Julianne continues to shake off the fog of shock and confusion from the surreal crash and finding herself suddenly in a rainforest, she becomes more aware of her surroundings and notices the sound of running water. Well, dripping water, too small to even call a stream, an ambitious drip of potential. Still, this is great news. She knows that rivers are maps, if not highways, of the rainforest. Flowing water, no matter how small, leads to more water. This drip will become a stream, and that stream a river. She remembers the words of her father, who often said, "If you get lost in the jungle and find flowing water, stay near it, follow its course. It will bring you to other people." As the tiny stream grew in size, it actually became more difficult to follow as the undergrowth became thicker and debris from heavy rains created obstacles. She has no way to light a fire, and yes, she knew how to do it, but everything was soaking wet. During the dry season, humidity is 90% in the rainforest. Julianne was now in the middle of the rainy season. The darkness of the first night began to fall. Nights were difficult as biting bugs, loneliness, and despair make proper rest impossible. Exhaustion and fatigue quickly become serious issues as her lack of food weakens her even more. Back in civilization, Julianne's father refuses to believe that his wife and daughter were on the plane. He simply can't imagine that they would get on the dangerous plane after agreeing to avoid it. The next day, Hans hears the passenger list over the radio, confirming that the two people most precious to him were indeed on Flight 508. The following day, Julianne continues down the stream, but the constant climbing over fallen trees takes a toll on her limited energy. Finally, the stream is big enough that she decides to walk in the water. She only has one sandal, so she always steps forward with that to avoid sharp objects. She continues to hear search planes overhead, but the canopy above still enshrouds the stream. The jungle is hiding her. On the third day of her attempt to escape the jungle, Julianne discovers the first piece of wreckage, a turbine. One side of it is completely black. She imagines it must be from the lightning strike that she saw. On day 4, Julianne hears a sound that chills her to the core. The flapping of large wings. Her mother is an ornithologist, so she knew exactly what was making this foreboding noise. A king vulture. A large bird that would only be gathering if carrion, decaying flesh, were nearby. Moments later, she discovers why the vultures were gathering. For the first time, the second time of this nightmare odyssey, she experiences true horror. As she moves around the bend in a river, she sees a passenger seat with 3 people still in it. The seat is upside down, and the crash victims, having fell from the same height as Julianne, have been driven 3 feet into the jungle floor, legs splaying upward. Let's step back for a moment, because sometimes descriptions can go by faster than our mind can process what is, in this case, a fever dream macabre image that is high-octane nightmare fuel. A young girl injured, alone, scared, in certain shock, in complete survival mode, stumbles across something so graphic that it must have been all but impossible to process. The king vultures perched waiting to feed. While understandably apprehensive, Julianne was also practical, based in reality and somehow in control. Remember, she's the child of scientists, not fantasy writers. Knowing other bodies could be near, possibly even survivors, she searched around but only found more metal debris. Around the 5th or 6th day, she hears the call of a huatzin, or false chicken, and that gives her hope. It was a distinct call that's a mixture of buzzing and groaning. She heard this call often from her family's jungle home in Panguana, and she knew that this particular bird nests exclusively near large bodies of water, close to rivers, exactly where people tend to live as well. Finally, Approaching the river, she found her path blocked by driftwood. She spent hours trying to get around the obstacle, and soon she ran into another barrier of densely packed reeds 15 feet tall. They have stalks covered with sharp edges that cut. She makes it to the river. It's about 30 feet wide, allowing her to, at last, see open sky. A plane flew somewhat near. She waved and waved, but the plane soon faded away. She couldn't help being angry that she was finally in a place that she could be seen and there was no one to see her. The anger quickly turned to despair as the openness of her current location also amplified her loneliness. She knows that she could be the only person within thousands of square miles. The words of her father came to her. Where there's a river, people cannot be far. She gathered her resolve and tried to form a new plan. The riverbank was simply too overgrown to hike along. The dense vegetation would make poisonous snakes and spiders way too difficult to avoid. She decides to wade through the shallow water near the bank, using a long stick to sweep the ground in front of her for dangerous stingrays. She moved forward with great caution, always leading with her one-sandaled foot. But the mud and constant hidden debris became too frustrating to navigate, so she moved to the deeper water of this Amazonian river. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? A river in the Amazon has what in it? Flesh-eating piranha. Yep, this is where they live. And there are also caiman aplenty. Now, if you're thinking caiman, those are the small alligators. Well, there are two species of caiman. One is 16 to 18 feet long and weigh up to 1,100 pounds. The other is the spectacled caiman. These are only about 6 to 8 feet long and usually max out around 200 pounds. So one is bigger than you and the other is the size of your average fever dream nightmare. But remember, Julianne is armed with knowledge. She knows that piranha only attack in shallow, still water. Did you know that? I did not know that. And caiman don't typically attack humans, so cool. With no fear and a bit of cautious confidence, she went into the deeper part of the river and found travel a bit easier. As long as she's right about the flesh-eating fish and the modern-day dinosaurs that lurk beneath the surface. As night fell, she tried to find a place on the bank that offered some protection from at least one position, a steep embankment or a large tree. Mosquitoes or other biting, buzzing jerks chased away any hopes of a restful, deep sleep. The only respite from the mozzies was the rain, a freezing, pelting rain that felt like pinpricks. She tried to use large leaves to cover, but the rain was inescapable. During these long, dark nights, she often wondered how her mother was doing. And what about her father? How was he? Her thoughts bounced around at night, a virtual battle of uncontrollable images and worst-case scenarios. But she did know one thing. She wanted to live. She pondered what she'd do with her life if she gets through this. She wanted to study biology like her parents. She wanted to do something that would benefit humanity. The cut on her calf had started to swell with white flesh, but didn't hurt. Inspecting the cut on the back of her upper right arm, she twisted her head around, a very difficult view. She discovered the wound was packed with maggots half an inch long. Incredibly, she was familiar with this. Her dog had had an injury that became infected with maggots, and her father used kerosene on the wound. This caused the maggots to come crawling out of the dog's wound and eventually healed. But she didn't have kerosene, just a twisted piece of metal that she used to try to pry the maggots out. As soon as the metal touched the little demons, they disappeared back into her flesh. Continuing down the river, she noticed that the animals didn't seem to be worried about her. Even howler monkeys, an animal known to be shy, didn't flee at the sight of her. She realized she was in an area where humans were not common and that she would have to travel even further to find help. December 31st, 1971, her father wrote to his sister. A week has passed already, and the plane has not yet been found. The weather is mostly good, so search should resume. It was clear that the plane had not been found, and some were speculating that it could have made an emergency landing somewhere else. Remember, this is the 70s, so communication wasn't like it is right now, where you know where everyone is every second of every day. Julianne's father was searching for a reason to hope. The next day, she awakens to severe pain on her upper back. A wipe of the hand reveals blood. She realizes that while making her way down the river, bobbing in the water, she was severely sunburned. Still, the river was the best way to travel. While getting out of the water to rest on the riverbank, she hears a strange sound that she immediately recognizes as that of baby alligators. She turns to see that she is dangerously close to a brood, and that the mother, which appears in the next moment, will certainly attack. The mother rises on her legs and races towards Julianne, who does what? Run into the forest? No. She slides into the water. Again, somehow, Julianne doesn't panic but relies on her knowledge of the jungle. By this time, she already had many caiman encounters. While floating down the river, she would often come across caiman that would run into the water at the side of her. Most of us would simply rise out of the water and run across the surface if this happened to us. But Julianne knew that caiman flee to the water no matter the direction of the perceived threat. She knew the caiman might swim under her or past her, but she was confident they wouldn't attack her. Hunger starts to overwhelm her to the point that her decision-making begins to be compromised. She sees poisonous arrow frogs often and decides that she must eat one. Fortunately for her, she's unable to catch one. On day 10 in the jungle, she struggles to climb over river logs and her strength fades further. She finds a graveled bank and decides that this would be a good place to sleep. Later, she awakens to see something strange and is convinced she's dreaming. She sees a boat. A large boat that she has often seen natives use. It can't be. She looks again. It's real. She then notices a trail going up the slope of the steep bank. She can even see steps in the trail. She was so weak it took hours to get up the embankment. At last, she gets to the top of the trail. She sees a simple hut and the boat's motor stored next to a container of gasoline, but no people. She remembers the maggots in her arm and uses a nearby piece of hose to pour the gasoline on her wound. The pain is excruciating. At first, the maggots try to escape by burrowing further down into her arm. Finally, she's able to remove about 30 maggots. It's a much-needed mental victory. She notices a path leading into the jungle, but she doesn't have the strength to explore it, so she tries to get some sleep. The floor of the hut is too hard, so she goes to the riverbank and, covering herself with a shirt she found in the hut, sleeps well for the first time in over a week. The rain pours down as she decides to stay in the hut for one more day to get rest. Despair and hope battle for prominence in her mind as she imagines many other passengers have likely been rescued. She's well aware that she's starving, dying, and that it's been too long since she's had any food. She tries again to catch a frog, but simply can't do it. Bonus fun fact here, while Julianne was struggling to survive, just a few rivers over, this was happening. Werner Herzog was shooting Aguirre, the Wrath of God. You'll remember he caught a different plane. Crazy, right? Around twilight, she hears something she hasn't heard in 11 days. Human voices. 3 men come out of the forest. When they see her, they instantly stop, shocked, even recoiling, almost as if ready to run away. Why? Well, what this dirty, blonde, half-starved, nearly dead white girl didn't know is that her eyes were completely red from burst blood vessels, likely from the sudden decompression when the plane blew apart. Side note, I remember a good friend of mine who loved horror movies once told me that little white girls were the scariest thing on earth. I suppose these 3 loggers would have agreed with her. Luckily, Julianne quickly spoke Spanish and told them that she was in the plane crash. While tending to her wounds, one of the men confessed that they thought she was the river goddess Yakumama, a serpent-like creature believed to have the ability to heal or curse individuals depending on their respect for the natural environment. The 3 forest workers gave Julianne food, dressed her wounds, and removed even more maggots from her arm. For those interested, the current maggot count is about 50 maggots. The men confirm that the airplane has yet to be found and that she is the only known survivor, but she can't believe it. The next morning, Julianne is placed in the boat and covered with a tarp. She sleeps deeply on and off for the ride back to civilization. As they arrive at the village, children run from her, screaming. An adult woman yells, "Those eyes! I can't look at them! Oh God, those terrible eyes!" This picture was taken shortly after she was rescued, and you can see that there is no white in any part of her eye. They were completely blood red. While Julianne was being cared for, a woman named Jerry Cobb, an American pilot, offers to fly Julianne to Pacaipa, where she can get better treatment and be reunited with her father. Perhaps sensing Julianne's understandable reluctance to fly again, Jerry Cobb explains that she is a highly skilled pilot. In fact, she was recently certified to be an astronaut for NASA, the first ever woman to achieve this qualification. Fun fact here, badass character Molly Cobb from the Apple TV series For All Mankind is based on Jerry Cobb. Arriving in Pacaipa, a doctor comes to check on her, and yes, even more maggots are removed from her arm, and a smaller wound in her leg. Side note, I looked up images of maggots to insert here. Nope, not gonna do it. I advise you to not look that up. I have serious regrets. The maggot hole in her arm was very deep. A 20-inch strip of gauze soaked in something to help sterilize the wound was painfully stuffed into the former maggot haven and current deep hole in her arm, and then pulled out and replaced the next day, again and again. A large splinter, which she wasn't even aware of, was removed from her foot. Obviously, news of Julianne Kopke's survival caused a media storm, but more importantly, authorities were finally able to find the crash site and begin recovering victims. There were understandably many who were suddenly filled with hope that if this 17-year-old girl could walk out of the jungle, surely there must be others to rescue. No other survivors were found, but it is believed that a few did survive the fall, possibly between 6 and 12, but later succumbed to their traumatic injuries not long after impact. Now, this is crazy. Shortly after her recovery started, when she not only knows that she's safe, but she understands it, believes it on a deeper level, her body and subconscious mind were no longer on high alert or in code red protection mode, something bizarre happened. As her guard dropped, she woke with a high fever that lasts for a couple of days and then disappears. And then her left knee swells up for no apparent reason. Why would it do that? Well, it turns out she had a torn cruciate ligament. She walked out of the jungle for 11 days on a torn cruciate, a virtually impossible medical feat. Her mind and body had ignored the pain signals because she had work to do. Was her desire to save herself so strong that she was able to override the pain of cuts, broken bones, infestation, starvation, and a certain disability she was suffering from so she could get home? Apparently so. A combination of military and civilian efforts took days, including many failed attempts, to get to the crash site. It was almost a comedy of errors, but it highlights the tenacity and knowledge of 17-year-old Julianne's efforts to escape the place that grown men trained in combat and survival struggled to get to. While it's undoubtedly true that luck had a hand in Julianne's survival, the tall jungle canopy, the position of the seat during impact, etc., all aligned in perfect harmony for this all but impossible outcome. But that was only half the miracle of this young lady's story, and luck had nothing to do with the journey out of the jungle that would have defeated most. The dogged determination handed down from her father, the love and knowledge of the jungle that her beloved parents shared daily, and the unflappable mental toughness that was Julianne's alone are why she survived and later went on to fulfill the dream of her parents and turn a once small remote science outpost created by two young newlyweds into a nature reserve to protect a fragile and vital ecosystem. Oh, I almost forgot. Remember this guy? Famed documentarian Werner Herzog? Well, 27 years later, Julianne received a call from Herzog. The two collaborated to retrace her steps and give her some closure to her remarkable survival in the documentary Wings of Hope. She even released her own autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky, in 2011. I recommend both of these, and I'm certain you will appreciate her book, which has a wonderful audio version. Thank you so much for watching. McNutt out. Thanks for watching. If you love true stories of survival, inspiration, and adventure, subscribe and check out Intelligence for more stories like the two you just watched. McNutt out.